Good evening and welcome to Inside the Rookery Season 7, Episode 2. For Season 7, we are continuing with our series of special episodes where I go into depth with a subject with one of the rooks. This week it is Andy Leask. Last week it was Andy Law, where we talked about GMing, so check out that link from last week if you want to know more about being a great GM, which he is. But this week we thought it would be a good idea to follow that up with talking about being a great player with Andy Leask, which he is. So you've got no problem. As a long-time fellow player and fellow murder hobo occasionally, I can confirm he is a great player. Sometimes a mediating influence, sometimes a worsening influence upon me, but we'll see. So we've got, as always, loads of questions pre-submitted by patrons on our Discord channel. Do join us on the Discord channel. It's a great community, really friendly. We are just all geeks who love talking all things roleplay, wargaming, nerdy in general. And as always, pop any questions or comments into the comments and I will bring them up if we have time and I spot them. So we'll get right into it. Andy, do you want to give yourself a brief introduction? And then we'll go into the questions.
Hi, I'm Andy. Is that too brief?
Yeah, that's a little bit too brief.
So yeah, obviously in the Rookery, those of you that watch LAWhammer know I'm playing Father Leopold over there. I have been role-playing, oh my word, like what? Like almost 40 years?
Well, Andy Law on a previous stream said almost all your life. So, I mean, you know.
And you and I have been playing together for almost 30 years. I don't want to alarm you with that. Yeah.
Yeah, and you and Andy, it turns out you met role-playing. So apparently you were playing maybe Elric?
30 years ago this year.
Shut up.
That was 1994 that he and I met. Yeah, playing Elric, jumping from dragon to dragon. It was good time.
I was about to say, like, don't give away, like, but you literally said 30 years ago anyone could do the maths. Yeah. Like when you said 1994, I'm like, don't tell them. No, wait, you already did tell them. Yeah, we're not a great partnership when it comes to maths-based problems and role-playing games, I have to say.
Oh, fair.
So yeah, and in that time you've worked for Games Workshop, you've retrained as an English teacher, you've taught English, you're a head teacher of English, you've written for role-playing games, you've literally won awards for writing for role-playing games. So, and in that time, I think we have had almost constantly at least one game, if not more, going on the side.
Yeah,
to greater or lesser degrees of intrusion into our real lives.
Yeah, I mean, I think at one point we did have like 3 on the go simultaneously. I think that's the most we've ever had on the run.
Probably the record. Which ones were those?
So I think like Vampire was technically still going, although maybe it was on a pause. And then we had at least 2 separate Wifrit campaigns happening at the same time. Because we had the Orders running alongside the whatever the Ashes of Middenheim one was called.
Yeah, that's true, because we were playing multiple characters, weren't we? But in different parts of the world at that time. Yeah.
Because you and I had less of a life than the rest of our party. So we got the extra side campaign for in between when the others couldn't make it.
No, because you and I are more committed to the art of role-playing than the rest of the party.
We value our fictional lives as much as we value our real lives, and
if not more,
if not more,
if not more. So let's start off with Martin's question, which is the most basic of all the basic ones, which we've been asking ourselves since we were 7. What makes a good player?
Yeah, I mean, it is a good, and I have to say, like, shout out to Martin. A lot of good questions from Martin tonight. I mean, to be slightly flippant, like, it depends on the game, and I'm not meaning that to be like evasive, but like the different game you're playing, both in terms of the rule set, the world in which you're set, and the group of individuals that you're kind of playing with, all maybe require something different, right? And I think it's maybe important to preface any discussion of a good or a bad player with, like, as long as you're not hurting anyone, there's no bad way of playing. You know, if you and a group of friends want to play like Murder Hobo D&D, where there's no characterization and you're just slaughtering monsters for gold, brilliant, right? If you're all enjoying that, great, love it. If you want to play a diceless system where it's all narrative and it's dense and it's to do with local politics in 16th century Russia, right? Because that's your bag. Fab, great, go for it. Neither of those appeal to me, but great, go for it. I think generally speaking, there's like a continuum in terms of like self-interest and party interest. And I think to be a good player, like it's not actually about being in the right place on that continuum. It's about being flexible with moving.
Yeah.
Because I think if you come to the game with no real investment, and I think we've all had that when we've seen people are not invested in the characters they're playing, or even playing board games, like, you know, where people are not actually interested in playing the game and they're just, oh yeah, what am I doing? They don't really care. That kind of saps the fun out for everybody.
Yeah.
It feels less real. Equally, particularly for an RPG, you know, like rocking up with an incredibly fixed view of what your character is and what your character would do, without any consideration of the other players and the wider story you're all trying to tell, that can be problematic. And it can also be good. Like, inter-party tension is great. And, you know, if we get to the question about my best player moment, it relates to that. Like, that can be really, really good. And it can be good to have characters have to persuade each other and have that discussion. But if you have a character, or it's a player, you choose to make your character stubbornly refuse to go along with the rest of the plot and derail the fun for everybody else at the table, that's not on. So to me, that's a bad player. And I'm lucky enough to say that I've rarely encountered players doing that. When I have, I've generally been able to call them out on it, and it's generally got better. Yeah.
I'm just thinking, I literally referenced an incident that happened in one of the very first Wifrup campaigns we played, where a dwarf happened to hit a barge with a hammer. Sank our barge. Like, we didn't even need James Wallace to sink our fucking barge. We sank it ourselves.
We should really have renamed that dwarf's character James Wallace. We should have found a way to say that in Casalid
over the years. But yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? We've all known a player or two who, at a point in their lives, or I say we all have, I have, who've like tried to work through, maybe unknowingly, outside issues in the game. Like, I can actually think of more things that make a bad player than make a good player. So maybe we'll get onto that in the bad player. But certainly using your group as your own free therapy is probably not wise.
Well, although, again, to go back to that original caveat, if everybody at the table's okay with that, then fine.
Yeah.
If everybody's doing that, I mean, what I will say, and I am alluding to a specific campaign that I know you will remember, Lindsay, is rather than working out your own issues, maybe if you're a couple that are playing, working out issues in that relationship around the table, that's a big X card, please. No, thank you.
Yeah.
And just to be crystal clear, I am not referring to Andy and Lindsay. That has never happened with them. But that has happened with two other relationships in two different gaming groups. So,
yeah, Andy and I are very method. We'll maybe come on to that when I'm doing a stream in a week or so. I think, I can't remember if it's next week or the week after, where I'm going to talk about kind of the flip side. So you're talking about what makes a good player at the table, and I'm going to be talking about how do you play a character, and there are various levels of, my character goes over here and does that, I'll roll the dice for them, and they say this, to being fully immersed in your character. So yeah, immersed. So Martin asked, would you insist on a session 0 as a player before going into a campaign, even if the GM is keen to just get going?
Pretty much, yeah. Pretty much always, yeah. I think the only exception would be if you knew everybody in the group already and the tone was really obvious what type of game you were playing, you know. So like if like, you know, like say for instance LAWhammer, like it was really important that we had, I mean, we really sort of almost had 2 or 3 session zeros really as we kind of worked through the characters and stuff. But that was really important because within that you had a group of like 3 of us who knew each other really well. Then you had like, you knew Kath's already, and then we had other people coming in that we didn't really know, and we were getting to know them, and we had to all kind of get to know each other. And so it was really important that we had time to do that, particularly because we were streaming it, but even just if we were playing it. But I think like if you and Andy and I and like one of our old kind of gaming crew, or to be honest, probably the LAWhammer crew now that we know them, were like, oh, we're going to play another Wifrup game. We don't really need a session 0 unless Andy's planning something different. We know Wifrup, we know each other. We can just we know where the lines are. We can kind of jump in with it.
Yeah.
Whereas if we was going to say, but we're going to play together, but we're going to play, vampire, and we're going to really delve deep into the horror, then we would definitely need a session 0 to establish boundaries and things like that. So
yeah, I've come round to the idea of session zeros. I didn't really know what they would have been for, but that's because, as you say, in the early days of role playing, we were just role playing with our closest friends most of the time, and occasionally, I think my very first session 0 that I probably had wasn't for a tabletop role playing game; it was for a LARP. And the person stood up and said, if you're in a relationship, you might want to reconsider that relationship before you embark upon LARPing. It was probably the best advice anyone has ever given about LARPing. So,
yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah. I think also session 0 is useful if you're swapping between genres, as you say. If you go from playing Wifrip to Paranoia, you probably want to
definitely
or
tone or
what you want to get out of that game, like why you're role playing it, what's the goal.
Yeah, and to be honest, like even if you were doing it, like I'm actually going to walk that back slightly. Like even if we were just playing, say, a Wifrip campaign and we know Wifrip really well with players we know, we still would probably want to do it because we'd want to roll our characters together and try and establish connections between our characters as much as possible. Now, not every GM or party necessarily wants to do that. They maybe want to have the whole, you meet in a tavern, having a bar fight, the kind of classic cliche. But I think, given the nature of it, if you take, for instance, Wifrip, given the fact that you do roll characters and you roll your careers and then you take your random talents and you try to make sense of why your character has done those things, and that then allows you to make connections. Like, we never played them, but like in one of our earlier Wifrip campaigns, like we had a session like that where like there's like 4 or 5 of us sat around making characters using 4th edition.
So much fun.
It was, and we just kept making characters, and like we never got to play most of those characters. Like, remember, you and I had siblings who'd run away from the traveling fair.
Yeah, they were the traveling fair siblings. Yeah, awesome.
And it was great, and they were going to be really interesting characters, but we just never got to play them.
I still got them because I keep everything. I've still got them written down on a piece of paper somewhere, so we can revisit them. Worry not.
Good.
In fact, my cultist. Oh no, I won't tell you anything about that because you're not allowed to know.
Cultist? With your reputation.
So, I think that party, although unfortunately due to life circumstances had to stop, I think probably they were more fucking heroic than our own party is, by the way. So, I'm just putting that out there. We may want to examine our life choices as a group. So, Darker Days Radio says, I think session 0 is useful because even amongst friends, week to week or month to month, private circumstances can drift and influence what's acceptable or not, which is why checking in during game is important. I think that's true. And I guess I would distinguish between what Chris is referring to there as session 0 and what you were talking about when you're having a session 0 to establish your characters kind of things. Because to me, that's kind of like session 0.5. Session 0 is like sitting down and either doing it really formally or doing it informally, talking about how you feel about certain themes and what are your red lines, etc. And I think Chris is right that doing that through the course of a game can be important.
Definitely. And I guess again it's the slightly skewed perspective that you and I have because so much of our role-playing experience has been with friends where we are checking in anyway, so we are talking about what's going on in our life anyway, and therefore would have less of an issue speaking up if something was problematic during a game, whereas there's always that pressure if you're playing with other people that you're in an uncomfortable situation and you don't want to be the one who has to say, I'm not comfortable with this, whereas we would quite happily be like, no, that's bang out of order, stop.
I'm also, our viewers may be confused, but Darker Days Radio is also called Chris and has been on our show a number of times, so that's why I'm just randomly. I hope so. I mean, it could be an imposter. It could be like a sock puppet.
Or it could be. Radio. Chris does do Darker Day Radios with a co-host, so it could potentially be the co-host, but I suspect it's Chris.
Sorry.
And people will know Chris. Chris is almost effectively an honorary rook. He has actually stood in as a fellow host with me to help me interview somebody. So about 5 co-hosts. There we go.
5 co-hosts. Yeah. And check it out. It is really good.
It is really good. Yeah. And Chris is a legend. So thank you again, Chris.
Yeah. I think Chris actually popped on our Discord that they're doing some deep dives into games where they're going to do a discussion about a game over a series of their podcasts. So do
Cool.
check that out if you're on the Discord.
That'd be
He's
good.
put the link there. Okay, so Smiling Tom asks, is an RPG player a storyteller?
Yes. Next question.
Next
I mean, I've been flippant, but yeah, like
Yeah.
it's a collaborative thing, and like you are responsible for bringing your own character, both in terms of you will drive elements of the story in terms of what you're trying to achieve with your character. You will respond to the things that happen from the other players and predominantly from the GM as your character. Regardless, you are driving the story one way or another. And then in an ideal world, you're all collaborating to try and make that the best story that it can possibly be, rather than be competitive. So,
do you remember when they first started talking about a mission to Mars? Obviously, they thought the biggest barrier to getting to Mars would be the boredom of the crew, because that's the most difficult thing about interplanetary transport. And honestly, there was articles about it, like, and what would we do? Because it was quite a while ago, and storage wasn't, so they were like, you couldn't take like a whole stack of DVDs, and you couldn't have enough books. And we had the conversation of, well, you just teach them how to role play. And I said that to some people who looked at me like I was insane, because then I had to explain what it was. But I feel now, if you said that, like, people would get that more, what you meant, that actually you don't need endless sources of entertainment if you're a role player to last your, I don't know, year-long trip to Mars, because you just have a book, some dice, a character sheet, and you've got everything you need to pass away the time. In fact,
infinite fun.
Going to Mars and just role-playing all the way there is in many ways the dream.
Yeah, I mean, that does sound pretty awesome. If anybody out there wants to strap us all on a rocket, get in touch. Yeah, no scheduling issues, as Mark says. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like, the GM would have a captive audience. It would be epic.
Oh, I love it.
We could finally finish some of our old campaigns. The exotic side quests that we took in Vampire that we never finished. So, Malt Zazar asks, can you name some essential guidelines for a player to cooperate with the GM?
Like, I think just openness and flexibility is the main thing. Like, it should never be. I don't think, and again, as I say, no wrong ways of playing. If you and your table like this, fine. But for me, it should never be antagonistic, right? Like, even though, like, literally the GM is controlling the antagonist in terms of the evil NPCs and whatever, the GM is not trying to beat you, and you are not trying to beat the GM. You are all trying to tell a story together. Your character is trying to beat the GM's character, and the GM's character is trying to beat your character, but you're not trying to beat the GM, and the GM's not trying to beat you. And I have sadly been in games, not with Andy, but with other GMs, where it has been like antagonistic. It has been like they're out to stop us winning. Like, that's what they think their role is. And that then forces the players into, well, our job then is to beat you and be better than you. And it's just awful. It's just not fun. It saps all the enjoyment out. So I think just remembering that and having a chat about it. And I think, like, and it's one of the things Andy's really good at is being open to having these discussions like early, so that you can start saying, well, actually, so, like, without no spoilers at all, but with, say, my LAWhammer character Leopold, like, who's currently in the Oracle career, and like, realistically, he's probably not going to move further up that tree, because that would basically derail the campaign if he did. So I've had that cult. Yeah, well, because he has to have like a cult following him around, right? Like, like that's the trapping for the next level. And it's like, well, I just, already I'm cheesing it by saying you guys count as my small group of hangers on. The next step up, I would need a proper cult. So, and that would work. So I've already sort of said that, well, okay, realistically, it's not urgent. There's loads in the career that I'm in that I want to kind of flesh out, but the time will come when I'm going to need to move on. This is what I'm currently thinking, although other stuff may come up. But that means he is aware and can be thinking about the NPCs that we might encounter in, 4, 6, 12 sessions down the line, that might give me the opportunity I need to go into the career that we're sort of talking about to make that feel more natural. And also, if Andy comes back and says, well, how about that? Have you thought about this? then that can also be quite nice. Like Leopold was never really going to go down the Oracle kind of career, but partly through enforcing my hand live during a session, but then also by tempting me, because he knows how easily tempted I am, by tempting me with cool stuff. That has ended up, and I've been like, okay, yeah, let's go that way. And Leopold has become a very different character from who he originally was going to be, and that's great.
Absolutely.
And he's not exactly what I envisaged, and he's not exactly what Andy envisaged. He is something better that has come out of the collaboration between the two of us, and it's very like, you know, you and Andy and I and Mark, like we've all spoken about that from like a writing perspective and a creation perspective, that when we work together, that what we create is better than what any one of us would have done. Like we all elevate one another's material. And I think the exact same thing is ideally true in an RPG setting. And I don't think that's unique to us, much as I'd love to be, you know, all smug and feel like it is. I think when I look at what the stories that people on our Discord sort of share about their parties, when I think about, you know, Brad the Pit Fighter.
But I was going to say Brad the Pit Fighter.
Right?
Smiling Tom is here. He's had a Lego emergency, but he is here.
He is here. Excellent. I mean, I'm curious what the Lego emergency is, but yeah, let's not get derailed by Lego. But I think it's clear, and I see that whenever I see people telling good stories about good campaigns, it's because players and GMs are working together. And conversely, whenever I see people, posting sadly about experiences that they're having, it's almost always because either things have got antagonistic or because people have just drifted away and become apathetic and not engaged. And that's the problem. If the GM is the only one driving the story, if the players aren't driving the story, that's a real energy sap for the GM. Equally, if the GM is too authoritarian and doesn't want to let the players have any control, that can be quite stifling for the players. You need that back and forth. You need that sense that you're working together.
Yeah, and in LAWhammer, there's been a couple of times on the stream that one of the players has said, "Oh, I think I should probably take a stress point for that," which, like, to me is almost unheard of in most games. Like, willingly offering to take one of the currencies that affect your player. But I mean, no, none of us would ever offer to take a corruption point. We're not like we're not masochistic.
No.
But you might offer to take a stress point.
Or I mean, there is the time I spent a fate point to save an NPC, and you've done that as well, haven't you?
My character, I had her spend a fate point in her background when we were doing flashbacks to save a character. And actually, it would have been really interesting, because if I had not spent that fate point, something fundamentally different would have happened, and it would have completely changed the character, which would in and of itself be interesting.
Yeah, and if I hadn't spent my fate point, Gerhardt would not be betrothed right now. So yeah.
Oh, I forgot about that. Yeah, that's true. So Martin asks, have you ever been a bad player?
I mean, almost certainly.
We all have, right?
Exactly, and probably much more when I was younger and less aware of that. It's interesting. Streaming the game has really changed how I think about the game, and it's mostly great. I'm mostly really enjoying it. But there definitely are things where I'm conscious that the game playing is being impeded slightly by the slightly performative nature. Not too much, but slightly. And there was a point. So I was conscious of a thing, and I will keep this vague. So if you're not up to date with LAWhammer, there won't be any spoilers. But this relates to 2-3 weeks ago. And we were in a situation where it would have been unwise for Leopold to go out and openly walk around on the kind of streets. And we were trying to work out what we were going to do. And we didn't really know. There wasn't like an obvious, there's the bad guy we need to go and fight, or there's the thing we need to do. And we came up with a plan that we were going to go and talk to someone. And I think it was just like I had a different perspective in terms of what that conversation was. So I thought, they're going to have a quick 15-minute conversation with an NPC to find out who's the person we actually need to talk to. So probably it would make sense for me to stay on the barge. Whereas everybody else was like, that is clearly the next locus in the adventure. We are all going there to do something to kind of progress the story. And I just, whatever reason, did not pick that up. So I'm like, well, I'll just stay. And then we're like, well, no, you should. No, I'll just stay. And then everybody started going, no, you should. And I was like, right, okay, I guess I should come then, right? Okay, well, and then what I had to frantically do was go, well, how am I going to make that make sense? Because to be blunt, it didn't make any sense. Like, you know, you're going to talk to somebody with which my character has no particular connection, so isn't necessarily a bonus, a benefit in there. The real world thing, if I were going to be that stubborn bad player who sticks purely to the player, I probably would have dug my heels in and stayed. But I thought, well, that's not what I want to do. I don't want to be a bad player. And the way I came around, I thought, well, okay, now Leopold does his auguries and his divinations and things like that. He's probably becoming over-reliant on that. So he'll do that and see what happens. Unfortunately, I did that, fumbled, got a Wrath of Gods, all manner of stuff went horribly wrong, and then it ended on a cliffhanger.
Yeah, so, and that's also like part of that is if we had been playing but not streaming, you probably just would have been like, time out, like out of character. Exactly. I don't quite understand why you all want me to come, but we were streaming, so we're all performing, so you didn't have. So I would say.
Well, I was going to say it's maybe something to ask our LAWhammer audience. Like, would that have disrupted their enjoyment, or would they actually have enjoyed the fact that we briefly spoke as players before returning to kind of speaking as characters? Because I don't know. Because you're exactly right. Like, I literally, that's what I wanted to do, and I thought, well, I haven't established if we can do that or not. And I just went, I'll do an augury. That's all I'll do.
Yeah, but what you're saying there is like to stop being a bad player in the usual course of things around the table. You would talk about things like that's how not to be a bad player is if you're not feeling comfortable with something, or if something's annoying you, or if you don't understand something, you just ask and talk about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, Seago asks, having been a player for a number of years, do you have any rules to help newbie players out to get into character?
Interesting. I mean, I think there's a million and one different things you can do, and like nowadays, role playing like core books are getting better and doing stuff. Although actually, even if I think back to, you know, when I was the early days of my role playing, anyway, certainly, and thinking about things like Cyberpunk with the life paths that had and stuff like that, like the questions that tend to come in role-playing game character generation sections, things like, you know, what's your character's best memory? What's their worst memory? What are they proudest of? What are they most ashamed of? What are they most frightened of? Like, these are things that will probably never come out of the table. And I know there is a school of thought that says if your backstory doesn't come out of the table, it's irrelevant. I know that is a meme that goes around the RPG kind of social media every couple of years. I disagree. I think you have to be flexible with that. You can't, just because you've written something, your backstory doesn't make it true unless you've communicated that to the GM and the other players. But I think it's really important to have, for me anyway, to have some sense of the inner life of the character, of who the character is and this or that. And it is important to then communicate that with other people. Ideally, in character at the table, you know, finding ways to kind of drop stories in, like things like it finally freaking happened, but I finally got to talk about a very famous Warhammer NPC that was in Leopold's backstory. That when Andy and I were talking about it, we'd said, "Oh, and he'll have met her, and she'll have told him this, and that'll be a funny thing for you to drop at some point." And like 2 or 3 times, I met a vampire once, and like nobody bit. It eventually came out, but that was a thing that, you know, had been written into the backstory, and I was kind of waiting there to kind of come out. So,
by the way, in the chat, the overwhelming response is, please do authentic, out of character, clarifying stuff. It's really important for streaming games to do that. So
cool.
I just
next time I will. Next time I will. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. On this one, I'll be talking about that a lot more in my stream, because I do so many different things to help get into character and to help me build the character. But this is Andy's stream, and there's way too many to talk about here. So come back in a few weeks and we'll talk about it more. Martin asks, do you think one of the best insights into being a good player is to be a GM? I hope not, because I've literally been a GM once for my boyfriend I had when I was 16, and it was such a bad experience. I will never do it again in my life. So
I mean, I would similarly say,
player.
No, and like I GM'd a little bit when I was younger, but we were all bad players and bad GMs. Like we like, you know, because we were like at school and we didn't really understand. So it was either hostile and combative and we were trying to beat each other, like I talked about before, or it was the opposite. We were too kind, and it was like wish fulfillment. Like genuinely, we played a first edition campaign when I was at school in which we beat chaos. Like we won Warhammer,
Yay!
guys!
You won
Yay!
Warhammer!
But we won Warhammer through like through a metaphysical argument, which I was quite proud of, in that we had an amulet which banished chaos within like 10 yards or whatever. And then we're like, but in the ether, there's like distance means nothing. So if it's there, it's also everywhere. So I'm going to spend a fate point to shove my arm through this kind of warp hole and banish chaos forever. And the GM was like, yeah, I can't see a reason why that wouldn't work.
What I would have loved, though, right, is if that had happened and then you had just been hit with the metaphysical consequences of destroying a fundamental part of the universe that was the Aether. Yeah. And immediately all life ceased to exist. You're like, well, you've done it, guys. We've saved the world. Yeah. We've done it. Shit. No.
Everybody dies.
We've destroyed the entirety of reality.
Yeah. But
that's what Andy would do to us if we tried that.
That being said, what I would say is I think the other way, I think there is a degree of that. Like I definitely feel like having done, particularly more recently, having done a little bit of GMing for some of the kids in my last school, I definitely think that's improved me as a player. And it did. Sorry, other way around. Sorry, I think that improved me as a GM because I was aware of what they would be thinking of as players, if that makes sense. Like, you know, playing through like Night of Blood, which I have played through as a player, then running that as a GM, having played it. I was aware of the things that they might miss and the things that they might do. And then I overdid it. I over ramped up the tension. And instead they all got like really freaked out. I thought maybe we should just, you know, take our luck with the beastmen in the storm in the forest. And I'm like, no, don't do that. So
I think for me, one of the best insights into being a good player is to be married to the greatest GM of all time. I'm just going to put that out there. And live in the house with him and get constant feedback requested on my performance and like how, because what that's really interesting is because I get to understand from him what, from his perspective, seeing the whole story makes a good story and how I can contribute better to making that story and what things are important to him as a GM that to me as a player I would be like, I never would have realized that caused an issue for you that you then had to work around and then that, you know, had a knock-on effect to here. So I found it very interesting interviewing him.
Yeah. And it is nice. That is one of the things, you know, I mentioned before that sometimes, you know, the performative nature of streaming can impede the playing slightly, but one of the ways in which it enhances it is the fact that we do get feedback from our audience, which is lovely. So like for instance, like last night, you know, we were not playing our normal characters, and it was nice to get feedback, to hear that they went down well, because we're like, you know, literally, like, you know, at like what, 6:30, and he was like, oh, this is the guy you're playing, very, very little detail, I'm trying to eat my dinner, I've got everybody talking about sound issues all around me, and I'm like, who is this guy? And I was like, and I just randomly thought, who am I? I was like, I'm gonna make him really deadpan and make him often really sarcastic, but you can't tell he's sarcastic because he's deadpan, so sometimes he's serious and sometimes he's not. And inadvertently, without realizing, that fate played into the theme of the episode. And you know, that was, I would love to say that was planned, that was just luck, but yeah.
I was gonna follow up with a different question, but actually I'm now gonna follow up with this one because last night really kind of was a one shot for those characters, although they were very popular in the chat and people do want them to come back. I actually think
I would love to play
very well with that group. Martin asks, is it a different skill set to being a good convention one shot player to being a player in a campaign?
Yeah, and I think so, in the same way that, you know, the skill of writing a short story is very different to the skill of writing a novel. And, you know, I have read great short stories by authors who then have then read their novels and gone, the pacing's not quite there, or vice versa. I have incredible novels, and then you read their short stories, you're like, that's just a bit of a novel that you've cut out. And they are different, you know, and in the same way, in a one shot, or like a convention game, you know, you're telling a story over 4 hours. And so you need to have, like, in an ideal world, what that means is the overall story has the classic elements of the story, your exposition, your rising action, your climax, and your denouement. But then each character also has some kind of arc whereby they either overcome a personal challenge or fail to overcome a personal challenge. Like, that's the dream. Now, I don't know the extent to which one-shot GMs actually think about all that kind of stuff. I know that, for instance, like if when I do. I know that when Andy does, he does. But I don't know how wide that is. But certainly that's what I would think. Whereas when you're doing it over a much longer time, in a much longer campaign, you don't need to compress that all in there. You can have episodes that focus on one character, or focus on totally different characters that further the story. And LAWhammer, I think, is a terrific example of that, because Andy has kind of fed in those different, like had us playing NPCs, having played the fathers of our characters, or like influential NPCs and stuff like that. That, we could, if that were a one shot, then there would be no consequences, right?
Yeah.
So, if you're playing a one shot, you're playing an influential character, you come face to face with Karl Franz, you're at a one shot at a convention, you're like, I'm going to attack Karl Franz because why not? Because whereas if you do that in the long story, you're like, well, that NPC is still alive, and Karl Franz is still alive, and we're doing a flashback. They can be so. And it's, none of us had to be told, don't do anything that would break the timeline. But we all understood that there were consequences, that we were playing in the past of the world that we were playing in, and so we kind of respected the narrative of kind of what we were doing and where we were going with that.
I think also the difference between good convention and being a player in a campaign is that sometimes in a campaign you can have a whole episode that's maybe. Now I refer to our sessions as episodes, clearly, because of LAWhammer, but you can have a whole session that's like about the backstory or the dynamics between one or two of the characters, and the other people can take more of a backseat that week. And then the next, and then some weeks it'll be a completely full party, it'll be all combat that week, and that's just what it is for that week. Whereas if you're in a one shot, I think there's more of the concept of understanding that, like, you're all there just for a short period of time. You kind of have to pass the spotlight round. You have to share in the story. You have to all contribute to moving the story forward, or you'll just be there 3 hours later having talked about, I don't know, how you're going to get into the castle.
Exactly, or rolled some dice because some orcs attacked you, and and this is, we're straying into GMing territory here, but just briefly, and I don't know if Andy spoke about this type of thing last week, but one of the ways in which Andy very cleverly manages to engineer those kind of things in one shots is through character specific, like, goals and targets and mini games, basically. So your character has to say this type of thing, or your character has to do this type of thing. And he does that in LAWhammer streams, but he does that in con games as well. And that works, right? Because you're like, well, and sometimes it can be totally random. Like, you pick one, shuffle them out of the deck, and you don't know what you're going to get. But it gives your character a secret identity, a secret mission, a thing that you're trying to do, which you either do or you don't do. So your character has that arc, has that thing. So he's responsible for the main narrative in the one shot, but each character then has their own chance to. Each player character has their chance to have their own little arc as well.
And I didn't realize that Andy often, when he does that, doesn't know what each player's got. So it's a surprise for him.
Yeah,
like,
which is great.
That's insane to me, but it's brilliant. Yeah. And that's for him, his trick to keep it fresh when you've played the same one shot, 50, 100 or more times. So May asks, what can you do as a player to help when another player is acting up or causing disruptions?
It's interesting. I mean, like, with well, as I say, like we have, and I cannot recommend highly enough playing extended campaigns with your best friends, right? Like, that is awesome. And that does make it much easier. In that they're much less likely to act up, and B, if they do, they stop being a dick. Oh, am I being a dick? Yeah, you did this. Oh shit, sorry. Problem solved. Move on. Like that is, and and it's hard to legislate because it depends on the player dynamics, right? It depends on who knows whom and what people's relationships are, kind of with each other. The obvious one is modeling. I think is the
role
key.
model. Yeah.
And I think that's really useful for getting newbies on board as well. Is just show don't tell, right? Like, the thing about responding in character, or passing the spotlight or any of these types of things, the best way to do it is, if you've got a couple of people who know how to do it, is just get them to do it. Get them to occasionally, I will remember to, remember to actively kind of talk to that person. And look, we're all human. We all make mistakes and we get lost in the moment and we forget to do it sometimes, and that's fine. But I think that's the key thing. It's one of the things I've really enjoyed, because obviously Sage in our party is sort of new to Warhammer, but also her character coming from Nippon is got this whole new background that she's kind of writing kind of in concert with Andy, which is terrific. But she and I, quite often, I give her a lift home after the sessions, and a few times we've had these like theological conversations, because we're both playing, blessed characters, or are we? Stay tuned with the most recent updates to find out things on that. But what that has been, I remember having a conversation about what to do in Bergenhafen about taking something valuable out of the vault in the place we were staying, and me saying, well, actually, no, you should leave it. And it's a challenge to you as a Ronaldo should be to break back in again and steal it without them knowing that you've done it. And that's like almost like a pilgrimage for you. So
And
it was like, and it was just those, having those conversations, modeling and being somebody to not impose an idea on somebody, but just to have that conversation about, and then model it at the table. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. What is that? Can anyone else hear that noise? It's like someone is like coloring in. It's like shh. Anyway, tell me in the chat if you can hear it, or if it's just like in my mind. It could be in my mind. We're not going to rule that out. Okay. Roderick asks, can you tell us about a time when you found it really hard to keep in character and out of character knowledge separate? Yes, all the time, Roderick, when you're playing a know-it-all elf.
Yeah, simultaneously.
Who doesn't actually know anything.
Yeah, well, simultaneously all the time and never. It's really weird, right? So like, I can't help but react when I recognize, and I've stopped trying on the stream. I won't react in character, but I will react out of character, because I can't. And I was like, there's no point in me trying. Plus, the people in the chat will be reacting. So if somebody like exactly, G-Thog, or somebody name drops like Egrin Van Horseman, or a vampire called Von Karstein, or a troll slayer called Gotrek, that happens. I am going to look at the camera and like that, right? That is going to happen, but that's okay, right? That's my out of character kind of reaction. I then have no problem at all ignoring that kind of in character. What's been the biggest test for me has been, and we're now past the point where I know really much detail about where we're going, Enemy Within. I don't think I played all of Power Behind the Throne. I've played some of it, but I really don't remember it once. Whereas I have played Shadows over Bergenhafen and Death on the Reich like 4 times, 5 times, something like that.
Yeah, but like, Death on the Reich was so different this time. So,
well, to be honest, it's been so different every time. Like, and partly that is Andy is changing things and switching things around, but partly genuinely, even the things that were like the same or the same icons. So, for instance, again, without any specific spoilers, but like an undead with a certain thing hanging around their neck. I had no memory of that. And then we met them and I'm like, oh yeah, that happened last time, so didn't it? Like by focusing on all that stuff I said before, focusing on the inner life of my character and the interactions with the characters that are happening around there and having those goals and just keeping myself focused on that. And what my character wants to happen in this session, what they want to happen in the next few sessions, what their long-term goal is, how they think and feel about all the other characters around there. That is more than enough mental noise to drown out the little meta Andy at the back who's going, oh, you're going to go there, you're going to go to that castle, you're going to find that thing. Like, and genuinely gone. And like, again, lots of things were very different about Castle Wittgenstein. But it could have been exactly the same because genuinely I couldn't really remember it. And then after we went through it, I was like, oh yeah, that was different because when we did it last time, it was this. So it was only after the fact that it's coming back to me. And I don't know if that's just because I have so much information in my brain that by just not focusing on it, it doesn't, pop up. But.
Yeah, because Suejin's also, who's got a migraine, so I hope you feel better soon, has asked a similar question. I read widely and always find it difficult to keep my knowledge and character knowledge separate. Can you suggest any strategies? Like writing down stuff that that's part of the reason why I started the dwarf rune thing for Alamenowai. So I've started a dictionary of all the runes that we have encountered in game and that Leopold, Andy's character, has translated for me, so I can remind myself that actually she didn't know the Master Rune of Alaric the Mad in a way that would trip off her tongue, unlike in the way that would trip off our tongue. She didn't know the names of all the rune fangs and their translations and little facts about them, which I have gathered over the years from writing for Warhammer, for playing Warhammer. So yeah, I do it in a way. That's one of my strategies, to take in character journals and notes for my character, so I can at any moment look back and see what she knows, as well as taking notes for myself that are kind of from the outside perspective. But I take a lot of notes. It is known.
It is true.
It is true. And I doodle a lot at the same time. How do you play a good character, Nico Davout, and endure pesky elf characters? It's easy. It's easy for him.
It's really easy. What I will say, actually, this is one thing. This relates to, I don't think being a bad player, but it is interesting. It's something I have noticed. So, because obviously we're playing with people that perhaps we don't know as well, and because you and I like know each other so well, and we talked before about how we have a total shorthand, how we could communicate in solely role play references, and no one else other than Andy would have any idea what the hell we were talking about. But what that does also mean is that we can and have had in the past repeatedly, like intra-character, kind of tensions and conflict. And we know that that's okay. Like we know that our friendship is not our characters that are arguing, not us. What I've noticed is, because we're playing with people that we're maybe not as comfortable doing that intensely with, you and I are both defaulting to winding each other up. Perhaps more than we should be. I don't know if you've noticed it, but I noticed it the other week. I was like, why am I responding to that? And then yesterday it happened with totally different characters, and the same thing happened. And I think it's just because we know that we can. So therefore we will push each other a little bit more and react more outraged. That's true.
Yeah. So in the stream, I think we're thinking about color and tone and up and down. You're thinking about your character, but also how it's coming across. And if there's an opportunity to like ramp up the tension, then I'll always choose to do it with you rather than with somebody else in the group. That is actually true. Yeah. As a tactic to allow the tension to be ramped up, but in a way that,
Unfortunately for you, I've decided my new strategy is to stop rising to your challenges. So we'll see.
Well,
that's
see what completely legitimate. Yeah.
But that's my strategy. I'm probably not going to remember to follow it.
Yeah, good luck with that. I'm pretty annoying.
Yep.
Yeah.
Not you, Alamenowai.
Randall. Well, I don't know. I'm pretty annoying too. I think the question's about real life knowledge keeping separate from in-universe knowledge.
Yeah. That's exactly what I mean. Like if we meet, I'm trying to think of an example. Like if we bumped into a character, and I mean, but I can give you a character like Leopold in his backstory has met Luther Huss and like knows Luther Huss, and and I obviously know what Luther Huss is going to go on to do. Or when 2 weeks ago, G-Thog, I thought when I got a vision, I interpreted Andy's words like, as Leopold was like, I've got no idea what that means. As Andy, I was like, I think I know what that means. It then turns out I did not know what that meant, because it wasn't the character I thought it was.
And like, you say you were playing vampire, right? And you were playing a vampire who's literally just woken up from torpor in 1960 something and encounters the Beatles. Like, you know how to not inject any of your own Beatles knowledge into your character. Like, it can be tempting, but it's actually not that hard if you think about it with those lines. Like, you could do it if it was about all the stuff Lindsay knows in real life, and I suddenly have to play a vampire, who's been asleep for 40 years. I think that's doable.
Yeah. And that's sort of the point, is that I can out of character react based on my out of character knowledge, but that doesn't mean that in character I have to react based on that same thing. Like, because there is that very clear distinction. And again, that's one of the things that I think I found easier because we're doing it on stream. So I'm very conscious when I'm like, oh, I'm breaking character, and Andy is reacting to that, but now I'm back as Leopold again, and I've got no idea who this character is.
I think it's your mic. Do you have a mic that's hanging down, that's brushing against you?
Oh, no? Maybe it's switched that. It should be using my laptop.
Right? I think it's using your mic. That it sounds like it's
it is
shuffling against material. My keen elf ears identified the problem. Okay. So another. Oh, let's go.
I'm going to try.
Can you still hear me?
I can still hear you. We've now got a different kind of interference, but it's fine. It's less annoying than the shuffle.
Is it less annoying? Okay. That's you just use my default laptop.
Yeah, it's a bit more echoey, but it's better than having. Oh, Rando of Arg says no. You don't like that, Rando of Arg? Oh no, I'm so confused. It's a chat saying that we can't talk anymore. So Martin asks, do you like to underpin your character with a tragic flaw?
A flaw, yes. Not a tragic flaw. And I suspect Martin knew when he asked this question that he was going to get an English teacher response. In that a tragic flaw is a very specific thing. Rango's saying they can't hear me.
Oh, I can hear you. Can no one else hear you?
I don't know.
Well, you're not talking right now.
I'm not talking right at that moment. It was a joke about... Damn you, Rango, you got me. Yeah, so like a tragic flaw is specific. Right, I'm going to get up on my little soapbox, as I do this all the time. So the first thing is the distinction between hamartia and tragic flaw. Hamartia was a thing in Greek tragedy. It is an act that a character does. Yeah, there we go. He knew me. He knows his audience. It's an act that a character does where they transgress a kind of divine law, and therefore they will be punished kind of for that. So Oedipus, kills his dad,
like twin theft.
Yeah, right. But the point is, like we say, Oedipus kills his dad, does not know he's his dad, marries his mum, does not know it's his mum.
Yeah.
He by the moral code. If they hadn't been it, there was nothing wrong with him killing that person or marrying that woman, except that they were his dad and his mum, which he didn't know. He's broken the divine law, therefore he must suffer as a consequence of the curse comes and all that kind of stuff.
That's sad, but okay.
Whereas tragic flaw is more that we saw generally regarded around Shakespeare, although not necessarily the first, but definitely the one that kind of popularized it and stuck it kind of with us, is that the consequences that happen to the character are not because of something they do, but because of something that they are. So like it's not Macbeth. A single. Yeah, so like Macbeth doesn't just do one thing. Like, yes, he does the first murder, and that's bad. But had he stopped then, he wouldn't exactly been a good guy. He still did a murder. But he then also...
Gosh, he's done a murder.
he's done a murder, but
Macbeth's done a murder.
But he then killed the grooms. He then killed Banquo and tries to kill Fleance. Sorry, spoilers for a 400-year-old play. He then, he then becomes a tyrant. He then puts spies in everybody's house. He has Macduff's family killed, and he escalates and escalates and escalates and escalates. Which is why, again, I will die on this hill that ambition is not Macbeth's tragic flaw, because he himself rules out ambition as motivation, and if once he's become king, it's not ambition that drives him to do those terrible things. It's his insecurity and his masculine pride. That's what his tragic flaw is. So to return to Martin's question, because I know he knew he was getting a soapbox for that, not a tragic flaw as such, because certainly not for a long campaign, because you don't know how that can, particularly not Warhammer, you don't know how that character is going to die. You've got fate points. They might last quite a long time. And, for it to be a tragic flaw, it has to kind of lead to their downfall. What you do want to do is build in character flaws, though. Things that are going to cause you problems, things that hopefully some of which you will gradually work through and change, but perhaps replace with other kind of flaws. But not necessarily things that are going to lead you to a terrible death or derail the entire party, unless you're out of fate points. And then at that point, you might look at your flaws you've got and go, how can we set this up to be a tragic flaw that's going to lead to the kind of very end of the character? So like with Leopold, I was talking before, he had for a while, he had this sort of slightly, as one might expect, the kind of overconfidence of somebody who is absolutely certain that their God exists, that they are blessed, they're doing what their God wants, and it doesn't matter that everybody else disagrees. They're right, and they know, and there's a little bit of smug overconfidence in that. Now, he's lost that because of all the things that are going on, and that's what the meditations thing that I shared with our All Access patrons about, with Leopold kind of his inner monologue as he's sort of struggling with all this kind of stuff. But at the same time, he's lost that flaw of overconfidence, but has now gained the flaw of he's becoming overly reliant on doing his divinations and his auguries because he doesn't bloody know anymore. So he's looking for that certainty that he lost. So it's the flip side of what he had before. And at some point he'll gain that certainty back again, and then he'll become overconfident. And that I suspect that will be his journey. I don't see that ever being his undoing, though. I don't see that being what will lead to his death necessarily.
Yeah. Whereas I like to, especially if I'm playing a character that's rolled randomly, like some of our, most long-standing characters were rolled randomly, albeit no, they were rolled randomly. I like to roll them randomly so I know what they are, and then talk to Andy Law and the other players about who they are. And I don't really think of them as like a character who has a strength and I'm gonna give them a flaw to counteract that strength. I like to know their background, and I like to know their whole life and just build a character that is like, you wouldn't, well, some people might, but you kind of wouldn't say about yourself or a friend of yours or a teacher you like, yeah, I used to work with, such and such. I mean, they had a tragic flaw. Like, that's not how people are, really. Yeah. And I guess when you're telling a story, maybe that element of it is a good thing to consider from a GM perspective.
Yeah, and I think as well, though, that's also that's a paradigm thing. In that, as someone who is like an English graduate and an English teacher, I've spent so much of my time, and a theatre critic as well, like I spend so much of my time deconstructing and analysing stories and how stories are told, that I wouldn't say tragic flaw, but I do. Like, if I'm thinking, like, I could, like, I'm not going to do this, but say, for instance, as a leader of a team, I could look at everybody in my team and I know what their strengths and their weaknesses are, and I think of them in that way. I think of what their character flaws are, but how their character strengths might overcome with that, and things like that. None of them are tragic flaws. None of them. To stress, my department are lovely and very, very good. But I'm aware of the things that might cause more upset there, or might disrupt things more there, and that is just how I see it. But that's probably because my paradigm is analyzing stories. So
yeah, whereas mine is, I like to go into the character, and the characters usually don't know. What I'm trying to get at is, like, you don't really know your tragic flaw. You don't, because that's what makes it tragic, right? The fact that you don't really know. I mean, sometimes knowing it does make it more tragic. I'm just talking myself in circles.
But
we'll
also
get back to that another time.
But this is perfect. This is the perfect distinction between this stream and your stream, right? Because as a player, for me, it's really useful to know my character's flaws, whereas for you, as inhabiting the character, you don't think of it as a flaw, you just think of it as the character.
Yeah, exactly.
And neither is right or wrong. They're just different ways into the same place, clearly, because it must be compatible, because we've been doing it for almost 30 years.
Smiling Tom asks, are you the kind of player that comes up to session 0 with a 5-page written background? Have you found the right balance for that? I'm the kind of player, before you answer, I'm the kind of player that comes up with 5 months of one-on-one role playing with Andy Law to get my character's background. So.
That's an advantage you have over the rest of us mere mortals. I mean, not anymore.
You did used to.
Yeah, and not necessarily written up though, but I do a lot of thinking about it. I've spoken before about, because there's another question in there about finding a character's voice as well, and like that is a thing that's, I think, different for me than perhaps for a lot of other people, because, as I've spoken before about me having aphantasia, and so not having imagination, I have a very strong oral imagination. I hear voices all the time, but that does mean, like, when I'm writing a story, I hear the voices of my characters as I'm writing them. I don't see them, but I hear them. So when I write stories, I tend to write a lot of dialogue, or I write a lot of monologues or first-person narrative, because it's in the character's voice, because I can hear the character's voice, and I can go, no, that's not the right word, because that's not what they'd say. So what I will tend to do is I will tend to have some of it done, but I like to talk it out with someone now. So like the way Andy and I made Leopold, for instance, we knew he was a warrior priest because we were going for these iconic roles. And we were like, right. Yeah. And we just went through it and went, well, okay, what's his backstory going to be? And I was like, well, I think it makes sense for him to come from Uberstrike because I know Uberstrike really well. That way, all that knowledge I have of the place that I wrote, my character can have as well. That's very, very easy. We then tied him to the noble who was also going to come from Uberstrike, and we're like, well, that's good. So we'll think about what their kind of backstory had in common, and then we thought about, do we want to be a priest or a warrior priest, and we spoke about all that kind of stuff, and we just went back and forth and kind of discussed it, which was again much more fruitful than me writing it on my own. Because if I'd written on my own, it might not have aligned well with what Andy planned for the whole kind of campaign and the plot of it, but it also might not have combined well with the other characters. Whereas the slight flexibility, the kind of the back and forth of, and there were certain aspects of it that were important to me. It was important to me that he had been kind of wandering for a few years before we all kind of met. It was important to me that he had been a priest and then had moved to becoming a warrior priest. I actually wanted that kind of switch because I thought that was interesting. Although that might not have been at the start, that might be something that came up in conversation. And then I seized on it. I went, no, that is important. That has to be the central thing. Because I wanted him to be I wanted him to be somebody who earnestly believed in bringing the Empire together. And the truth is that dogmatic Sigmarism, for all it pretends to do, that does not really. So I knew he could not be a conventional Sigmarite. There had to be something about him.
So there's two more questions I want to do in our last minus 1 minute.
We're not in a rush, guys, right? And Andy's not here to tell us off. We can go longer than an hour.
Foolish Mystic Wonder. When you're building a character that's going to be an outlier of the party, how much do you want to lean into the differences, and how much space do you leave for some space for bridges with the group? Well, I suspect I know what you're going to say, but we'll see.
I mean, I think you definitely need to leave some room for bridges. Otherwise, you're not telling a collaborative story. You're telling a combative story. If there's no room for connection, right? So, if I don't know, let's imagine that Elric died and Dan's new character was a Norse berserker who was dedicated to Khorne. Who didn't speak Reichspiel, it just wouldn't fit, right? Like none of us could talk to them because we didn't speak the same language. None of us would ideologically be on board with them because they were a follower of the Runic powers. There just would be too much there that you wouldn't. And unless you were telling a particular story in which a group of people who totally hate each other are forced to work together, so they're all captured and imprisoned in a chain gang and they have to escape together or something, that can be an interesting story, like maybe a one shot or a kind of an intro to a campaign. But unless you're doing that kind of story, I don't think that's constructive. And I'm a big fan of weaving connections in. I think it's one of the reasons why the kind of session that Andy did last night, where we had those characters that we played, people are keen for them to come back. Maybe we'll do another one shot with them. But I guess there is the scope that should any of our existing characters die, we've got another character there that we played that we know who could potentially come in and kind of join us as a kind of a new PC. And they've already got a connection with Gerhardt. They've already met him. Now we just have to hope he doesn't die, otherwise they don't have a connection with the party. But what I mean, like working out those ways to kind of form those connections, I think is really important. So
Andy went over by 15 minutes last week, by the way. So
well,
we had too much GMing to talk about.
Well, let's just keep going then.
So Sego asked, has your player experience helped in your creativity in the Rookery? We are, after all, on Inside the Rookery.
Indeed.
And we have lots of interesting things in store in Rookery publications. So what do you think players can bring to the table in terms of creativity for collaborative projects? Kind of two there. Do you want to think about the Rookery one first?
Yeah, it has hugely helped. It helped with the Rookery. It helped a huge amount with the Uberstrike book, and it helped a huge amount with the Rookery in the same way. And that was one of the things that was particularly good, because so the stuff I did for the core book, we all worked on all different bits of the core book, but then immediately afterwards there was some material for the buildings of the Reichland PDF, and there was some stuff there, but it wasn't in a format that we liked. So Andy kind of gave me what was there. He's like, rewrite this. We need to find a different way to make it work. And we played about. We eventually settled on the rough kind of format. It wasn't quite as tight as with Uberstrike, but in terms of the physical description and then description of the use, and then the adventure hooks in terms of how a GM might kind of pull that in. And then when it came to writing the Uberstrike book, it was that but bigger, right? It was like that was the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
Andy was like, go nuts, these are your districts, do your research. They can write. So we went through the 3rd edition books and looking through Vermintide and looking at all of the named places, and those all have to be in there so that we got those touchstones. But then when I was having to work out the other places to include, that was when I switched to player, and I was like, okay. If I'm a player and thinking about Warhammer particularly, you've got your different careers and things. And I was like, well, okay, if I'm playing a dwarf, like where am I going to go? Like what
where?
None of these locations are going to hook me. All right, so let's go to the kind of the dwarf quarter and let's look at what locations are. Okay, if I'm a dwarf, brewer or engineer, where am I going to go? If I'm a troll slayer, where am I going to go? If I'm a Sigmarite, what's a Sigmarite temple going to be like for me to visit? Not for me as a normal player just to come in and pay your respects at Throng and then leave, but to actually go in behind the scenes and talk to the priests, what's going on there politically. If you're the criminal element, like that's a classic one. Lots of people play thieves and charlatans and outlaws and all those types of things. So I couldn't just present a respectable, civilized front to Uberstrike. I had to fill in, and that ended up being my favorite bit in the underports and not the underports, the Lowhavens.
The
Lowhavens. Yeah. Well, no, that's yeah. But guys, pretend you didn't hear that. You might read them later. I'm mixing up my halfling clans. But yeah, the Lowhavens that I kind of brought in, like this idea of like the organized crime kind of thing, and then that meant I was able to start drawing connections between the hooks. But I genuinely was thinking, what am I going to do with a player like that? What is that type of character going to do? What's a reason? So both in terms of the locations that were there and the hooks, and that has very much carried over into what we're doing in terms of the Rookery, in terms of the world building there, is trying to think, okay, if a party is like this, has these types of, and even more so because obviously we're maniacs and we're going for the system agnostic thing. So we want people to be able to use our stuff, whatever game system they're playing. So I have to think, okay, what's a D&D party going to do with this adventure? What is a gritty Wifrit character? What's a Call of Cthulhu party going to do with it? What's a, and actively think about how are they going to engage with it, right? If I set a thing up that it's a massive monster that everybody has to fight, if it's a low-level Wifrit party and they're all like lawyers and clerks and peasants, and they're not going to be able to fight that big thing. So there needs to be a different way. Yeah. There needs to be flexibility there in order for people to progress past the story, but also to engage with and interact with the locations that I'm writing. So like 100%, I'm really glad Seago asked this actually, because it is absolutely core to my kind of design philosophy, is thinking about what our GM's going to do with it and thinking about what our players going to do with it, which is something that some good RPG content really does, but I think a lot of RPG content doesn't. It thinks about the GM in terms of exactly they're controlling the narrative, so let's give them tools. And quite right, GMs do need tools. They do carry a lot of the weight there. But I think thinking about how the players are going to engage with it as well makes it easier to then tell these collaborative stories. One of the things I've shared publicly multiple times that I really struggle with in Wifrit 4th edition is coming up with short-term ambitions, right? It's a nightmare. If you're grounded in a town in which there are locations and other NPCs, that becomes easy. Like, oh, I'm going to get to know with and try and befriend somebody in that dwarf tavern. That's what I'm going to do. That's my short-term goal. I'm going to do, I'm going to go down the sewers and find out what's been happening with that thing. But by putting in the hooks and the things that places you want to go, the people you want to talk to, the things you want to do, the things you want to achieve, it lets players have those short-term goals that are hard sometimes if you're in a big, long, epic campaign where you're traveling all around the empire. That has many other benefits, but it's hard to come up with plausible short-term ambitions. So, yeah.
Do you have anything to add on the second one? Players bringing to the table.
Well, I guess that. I guess exactly that. Like I am mostly like I have GM'd and as well as having GM'd, like I have read a lot of GM facing content. And particularly while I was writing Wifrit and while Andy and I have been doing Rookery stuff, and we've all been doing Rookery stuff. Like, we have this little repository library. I'm constantly buying stuff when people shout out game systems. I'm buying them and kind of looking at them. When listening to Ludonarrative Dissidence, James's podcast that he does, I hear a good game. Oh, that's interesting. I'm going to go read that, and that's going to go in my head. And sometimes that's mechanics I'm stealing, but more often than not, it's strategies and thoughts and ways of doing it. But if I'm honest, it's my player experience, I think, is weirdly making me better at writing stuff for GMs, which sounds counterintuitive, but I 100% believe it to be true. Because I'm conscious of how it feels in a play. Andy sometimes does his own stuff or his own twist and stuff, but occasionally he has run things from the book, and he will quite honestly give us a meta commentary of, that was a bit rubbish. That's what was written in the book. Should have changed that. So it's what I'm trying to do is make sure that the stuff we're writing doesn't ever feel like that. So
yeah. Because as a player, you're going on one path through all these possibilities that the GM knows and that the writers have written in. But as a player, you actually touch a limited amount of it, and that has informed my experience in creativity, thinking about how each individual will impact a player. If that was the only individual they met in that area, the only place they went in that area, because that is sometimes how it goes.
Yeah, exactly. You just don't have time.
You don't want any of your stuff to just end up being like, well, that's just filler, so the GM thinks there's a lot in this book. Like, oh my God, no, you don't want that. You want every single thing to be, as we talk about in the Rookery, eye-catching and interesting and different, but without being that for the sake of being that. And I think that's where long-term play in a world has helped me, because it feels more genuine rather than you're just, right, what am I going to make up today? Oh, I'm going to make up this kind of person because I haven't had one of them for a while. You kind of think over your own experiences as a player.
Yeah, absolutely.
What has been your best player moment so far? What has been your worst as Seagull? I know you wanted to answer this because you were thinking about it earlier.
So like my best one, and you've heard this story, Lindsay, and although you were in the campaign, you weren't in the room when it happened, Aaron Burr. But it was in the vampire campaign that we did. And, obviously we played that campaign for a very, very, very long time. And it eventually turned into a 40k campaign. So it's like merged with our Wifrit campaign that turned into a 40k campaign. It was absolutely epic. Like my vampire character, it turns out, was Odin, who had sort of been reborn. And madness, absolute madness, but brilliant. But, we were initially playing through the Transylvania Chronicles, and sort of I think the climax of that, or near the climax of that, there's we went to the nuclear power plant that was in meltdown. Sorry?
I'm just miming what I think you're going to say.
Yeah. It's that moment. It's that moment. And basically, we did the thing which normally you're never meant to do, is splitting the party. But Andy deliberately had us split the party because some people had to go and stop the reactor melting down, and some people had to investigate the metaphysical problem that was happening sort of down there. And so I went down with our resident mad Malkavian. Who had thought he was a caitiff, who had thought he was his own child rather than actually being his own sire, who had a magic sword, and all manner of stuff. And we went down there, and stuff had been over. We'd been playing this campaign for, I think at that point, like 4 or 5 years in the real world.
Yeah, maybe longer.
Yeah, but certainly like hundreds of years in terms. Like we'd started in the Middle Ages, and now it was the 1990s, and stuff had been fed to us, and we all had our different characters. And my character being the Tal Mahiran, I had a bunch of knowledge, and his character being with the Fae, but was also mad, and had his bunch of knowledge. And your character being with the Sabat had their knowledge, and my character had also been in the Camarilla as an Archon and had that kind of knowledge. And so we all had different knowledge, and it was at the point where it was all, as Andy's want to do, sows all the seeds, sets all the separate threads, and then they all come beautifully weaving together at the end. And that was what was happening. And there was prophecies, and there was Kupala, and there was demons, and there was all manner of stuff. But we were down there, and I can't even remember exactly what it was, but there was like a rift like forming there. And we were like, what do we do? And it was really funny, because my character was this autocratic, or had been autocratic. He was much more mellow by this point, but had been this very autocratic Ventru, had been like a mercenary in the Middle Ages and
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. Jack of all trades, so he was the one who kind of kept up to pace with modern life and things like that. Knows all manner of stuff. Does not know what to do about a kind of mystical rift that appears to be forming. Mad Malkavian boy absolutely believes he understands all this kind of stuff because he's been to the realm of fairy, and did he, or was he just meant we don't really know. And we're sitting there, we're going back and forth about what a thing means. We're reminding each other of prophecies and stuff that we've had. We're getting it all up, and then we get to the point, and he goes, "That's why I've got the sword. I've got to swing the sword at it." And he goes like that to swing the sword. And at that precise moment, I'm like, "No, but," and Andy's like, "You can't talk." He started swinging it. What are you doing? And there was, and I can't remember the specifics of it, but essentially I knew that the person who'd given him the sword had given him the sword so that he did the wrong thing, not the right thing. And I realized that this was all a trap that had been set up for him to kind of do that. And he absolutely had to stop. Unfortunately, I did not. I did have a sword, but it wasn't drawn. And also, I'm not sure it would have stopped his sword because it was a big magic sword. And it was like, what else can I do? And I didn't have time to use words to kind of tell him. I had celerity, which meant I could act, and I had a metric fuck ton of fortitude because I was a Ventru. So what I did was I walked into the path of the sword, so that this character, who was my character's best friend, we'd been friends when I think he'd just been sired, but my character was immortal. We'd known each other for centuries. We'd been enemies. We'd been friends. All manner of stuff had happened. But I chose with my character to potentially die, and he didn't quite die, but it was very close. And Andy made us roll like he could easily have died, but he stepped into the path of that blade because it was the right thing for that character to do. And if he had died, I would have been fine with that. I would have been absolutely fine with that, because he did what had been the culmination of his story, in order to reach a climax of the collaborative story that we'd all been telling. And it was just beautiful poetry. And had he died at that moment, it would have been
a good end to his story.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry.
You always want that for your characters. That's the important thing. Because sometimes I think you can cling on to them for too long, whereas actually it's time for them to go.
Yeah. That is the thing. Like good, and like we've all seen TV shows that have outstayed their welcome. We've all read novels that should have ended 4 chapters earlier. We've all seen films that have gone on for just that little bit too long. And having that sense of what an ending is, and certainly something that I know as a teacher of creative writing, like that is something that students really struggle with.
Endings.
They get to what should be the ending, and then they carry on, and they're like, oh, and then we went home, and then blah, 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 and then we were friends, and then
and then I woke up and it was all a dream.
Exactly. And like I think that there's a terrific example that if anybody wants to look at like a perfect short story for understanding and modeling what a good ending is, there's a short story by the Scottish author Ian Crichton Smith called The Red Door. And a lot of his stories are set in this kind of rural sort of northeast Scotland fishing village, and a lot of them feature this character called Murdo. And there's this is one of those murder stories, and like basically it begins, he wakes up one morning and somebody has painted his door red in his cottage, and everybody else has the same, I think it's like a grey-green color. Everybody else's house is the same color. His now stands out, and Murdo's like, oh my, and he feels really self-conscious because in the pressure of this little rural village, he's gonna be, and most of it is just Murdo standing, looking at this door, thinking, oh, like what has happened? What is going on here? Trying to work out and beginning to realize that he'd always, on some level, wanted to stand out, but had always been frightened of standing out. And he slowly begins to work out who could have done this, and he works out that it's a woman who's kind of, I think, just moved into the village recently, but she's very much viewed as an outsider, and she's brave. She doesn't care the fact that the people in the church tut at her and don't like the way that she dresses and blah blah blah. And he realizes that she probably painted the door, and that actually he realizes that he likes that, and it ends with him crossing the street and knocking on her door, and that's where the story ends. Because we don't need to know whether she opens it. We don't exactly. The point is Murdo realizing something about himself through the symbolism of the door being a different color, realizing he's ready to, because he's unmarried as well, and she's a bit older and unmarried as well, and because they're both don't quite belong, and he realizes, well, let's not belong together was his idea. Now, it's not a romance story, so we don't know what happens with the relationship. But the point of that story Murdo's arc and knocking on the door.
Yeah.
So I reckon it's a great story, but I recommend it as a perfect example of how to end a short story when it needs to end. So yeah.
Yep. And I think your worst moments are always your dice. You're always let down by your dice.
I mean, which ones? I mean, although again, Andy found terrific ways of making that. So like one of the most famous ones in Vampire, particularly, like I would botch all the time, which is when you none of your dice roll successes in your dice pool, and there are kind of ones. I think initially it was if you had more ones than successes, but then it changed to if you had no successes and ones, which was good. I botched slightly less after that rule changed. But one of the most famous ones was like climbing a tree or trying to climb down a tree, I think, actually, and botching and like basically falling and staking myself as a vampire to the tree. But of course, that became part of the Odin backstory that Andy began to kind of weave in, so that, you know, that was my character hanging upside down on the tree of knowledge, learning something about pride and the hubris of pride and things like that. So
which
yeah,
he didn't learn for many centuries.
No, exactly. That was the pebble that began an avalanche like 300 years later. But yeah.
So on that note, I think thank you so much for coming along and chatting to me about being a player. We have gone slightly over, but it was good fun.
That's okay. It was indeed. It was indeed.
Next week, I can't remember who it's going to be next week, if it's going to be me or Mark, but it's going to be one of us.
I have a feeling it was going to be Mark, but I could be wrong.
Okay, well, you'll find out next week who's going to be coming on Inside the Rookery and talking about rookery things. And until then, thank you, as always, to all of our patrons. We absolutely couldn't do this without you, and we really appreciate your support. Thank you to our Discord community for being so lovely. Thanks to everyone in the comments and the chat, as always, for making this even more fun and interesting for us. Until next time, thank you, Andy. And all remains to say from me is... Goodbye.